Good afternoon, everyone. So before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respect to their elders and families, past and present. So my name is John Murray-Darson. I've been asked to MC today. I'm a laboratory head at the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Research Institute at the Austin Health, which is one of the 10 partner organizations of the VCCC. So as all of you know, the VCCC is a powerful alliance of 10 successful Victorian organizations committed to cancer control. Its role is to coordinate the collaboration between its member organizations and to develop a strategic program of work that integrates research, education, and clinical care to maximize patient outcomes in a cost-effective manner. So before I introduce our speaker today, I'll just, there's a few housekeeping matters to bring it to your attention. Mainly the 3 talks that we have coming up over the next 3 weeks in this Monday Lunch Live session. So next Monday, we have Mr. Misha Ketchell, who will be speaking on the conversation we need to have. The week after that is Mr. Grant MacArthur, not our Grant, although I've just heard Grant will be introducing Grant. So Mr. Grant MacArthur is a reporter for the Herald Sun, and he'll be talking about cancer in the media. And the week after that, we've got Dr. Drew Berry from the WEHI, who will talk about the molecular machines that create your flesh and blood. So please register for those events on the VCCC website. Okay, so that brings me to introduce our speaker today, who is Heather St. John. So Heather is the director of the MRFF, which is the Medical Research Future Fund initiatives. She's based at the University of Melbourne, where her role is to support all of the partner MAC organizations in securing MRFF funding, with a particular focus on the development of large collaborative initiatives and proposals. So Heather has an extensive track record in supporting the translation of new health technology innovations from the research phase through to adoption, fostering cross-disciplinary collaborations, developing research and commercialization strategy consortia, and securing multi-million-dollar funding to support these endeavors. So prior to joining the university late last year, I understand it's close to your 1-year anniversary coming up, Heather was the Chief Operating Officer at the Monash Institute for Medical Engineering and was responsible for establishing the partnership of 5 hospitals, 3 medical research institutes, and the university to accelerate clinical-led medical technology innovation. Heather commenced her research career as part of the international team that developed the world's first extended wear contact lens. She later commercialized a novel biomaterial that has been used in millions of life-sustaining devices. Heather has also had roles as Director of Industry Engagement at Monash University. She's been the Director of AOR Tech Biomaterials and was also Group Leader at the CSIRO. So today, Heather's going to discuss understanding MRFF funding opportunities, which will help us understand how to navigate within this new funding landscape. So please join me in welcoming Heather.
Okay. Thank you for having me here today. It's great to have so many of you here. And yeah, so I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about the Medical Research Future Fund, because it is such an amazing opportunity for all of us. So it's a huge injection of funds into the sector on top of the funding that we had before. So in the last budget, we had about another 1.7 billion committed to translational medical research. So there's a whole range of new types of schemes coming out, and it's a bit hard for everyone to keep up with them all. So today's going to be sort of a whirlwind trip through some of those new schemes and how we think you can get ready for them. So basically a bit about Medical Research Future Fund. So it's different to the NHMRC. So a lot of you would be familiar with the NHMRC and the funding for biomedical and clinical research through that. The difference with the Medical Research Future Fund is it's squarely about priority-driven investment. So instead of the 1,000 flowers bloom kind of philosophy that is characterised by NHMRC, this is more about picking a few big things that are unmet needs in Australia and injecting large tranches of funding around those. There are some smaller specific schemes as well that I'll go into, but that's, you know, the main flavour of the type of difference. The other key difference about it is very much about the translational research space. So it's meant to build off the wonderful base that we have of fantastic biomedical discovery research and the high quality clinical and healthcare system that we have, and help address the gap that's in the middle. So getting more discoveries through to patient benefits. So it's basically supported by an endowment fund that sits behind the scenes that's steadily building and is targeting getting to about $20 billion. So they're about halfway through, they're on track with that. It's up at about 10 billion now. There's another major injection due to go in, I think, in about a year's time, and that will keep it then tracking up per annum in the amount that's coming out. But it's all a very new system, so it's only a couple of years old. In the first year, we sort of saw dribs and drabs of funding going out to different things, and in the first phases, it was quite confusing for everyone. There wasn't a lot of machinery and process in place at that point, but now that is starting to come together very well, and we'll talk about some of those new schemes. But it is definitely on track as it was initially envisaged. So as I said, it's for priority-driven investment, and I'll talk about how that process works. And it's going to, if it does stay on track the way it appears to be at the moment, probably get up to around 800 million a year going out in funding into the sector. So it's about as much money out into the sector as NHMRC puts out or ARC puts out, and it's on top of those existing schemes. In terms of processes, the key advisory group that recommends the strategy and the priorities for the scheme is the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board. And so they set on two timeframes. There's a 5-year longer term strategy that's the sort of underlying principles of what they're trying to achieve. And then every 2 years they do a rolling set of priority areas, and more specific topics are picked within that. And that's used to guide the Minister and the Department of Health in terms of where funding allocations are made. So these are the folks that are on the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board. It's been designed to have a mixture of different skill sets that inform that process. So some of these folks you'd recommend, click down the right way. There we are. You'd recognise Doug, for example, who's in our precinct. So there's a mixture of biomedical research. There's people who understand hospital and health systems. Karen Reynolds is medical engineering background, so to get that interdisciplinary mix, venture capital expertise. So it's really to have a different mixture of types of skill sets that can inform how we can do that translational space well. It basically is a big experiment in a way on our innovation ecosystem. So, and it is very young. So you'll see that they're trying out new schemes to see if they work in terms of getting more translational and impact-driven research happening. If those schemes work, they'll stay on the funding calendar. If they don't work, you'll see them replaced by new schemes. So today we're going to have a look at a snapshot of what's out there at the moment. But it's worth highlighting that where MRFF is meant to fit relative to the other types of schemes. So as I said, everyone would know NHMRC very well, and so it's particularly focused down at the discovery end, but also through to the clinical trials phase and into the clinical research phase. The other new scheme that has come online in recent years is the Biomedical Translation Fund, and that's really for things when they're getting out there into spin-out companies, so at the commercialisation end and getting that through. But what we were finding is that in Australia we were still particularly poor in getting things through in a rapid way from the discovery phase through to impact patients. So this gap in the middle is where the MRFF is particularly focused. It does spread right from one end to the other, but it's particularly in here that they're looking to make a difference. And so that's looking at things like there's a lot more funding going into the clinical trial space, but also getting things from a discovery through to a proof of concept phase. So moving right along. So as I said, there's two components to how MRFF funding is worked out. And I'd encourage anybody who's going to go for MRFF funding to read through these documents. They're available online. So there's the strategy document sets the broader scene setting activities. So things like strategic and international. It's looking at how can Australia play well on the international scale? Where do we have a leadership position and how can we invest in that? Data and infrastructure is looking at the transformation in the healthcare sector that's coming through with better use of data and how do we do that well? health services and systems. So MRFF is not only about new drugs and new devices, it's also about how do we organise ourselves well so that we have better delivery process and better delivery systems, and how do we embed evidence-based research into our healthcare system more effectively. Capacity and collaboration. So collaboration and translation are probably the two overriding words to describe everything to do with MRFF. They're really not looking for the smaller scale investigator-driven projects that are more characteristic of the NHMRC. So a hallmark of a good MRFF proposal is one that involves collaboration between organisations. They're looking to see input from different parts of the sector. So they're looking to see, do you have good consumer engagement when you're designing your research? Do you have good input from clinicians who understand where the unmet needs are? Do you have a range of the types of expertise that you need to solve your problem? So that might be not only biomedical research, but you might want to involve IT people or engineering people. How do you bring all those different types of skills together? What type of other organisations do you need to get this through really quickly? Would it help to have an industry partner or someone from one of the government departments and agencies? Do you need a philanthropic group to be involved, or patient advocacy? So all those types of things, they're looking for those mixed types of teams that will help you get through to impact. Capacity is that they're also looking for how do we build workforce capacity in the new areas that are coming online as this innovation wave goes through the healthcare sector. So where are our gaps at the moment? Do we need more people who understand how to do bioinformatics, or how to utilise genomics information out in a clinical setting? Those types of things. So what type of skills do we need to build up in our initiatives? Trials and translation, as I said, there's a lot of funding boost that's going into clinical trial space, about another 240 million recently announced. And translation is that piece about, okay, what's it going to take to get from the target that you've identified through to your new drug, or your new prototype device, or your new pilot of your new healthcare approach. And commercialisation is really that last end. How do we take things through to a point that an investor or an industry partner might want to pick them up so that they can run through with the implementation phase? Priority setting. So there was a first set of priorities that covered the 2016-2018 period. They've just done a consultation phase that closed recently. I think it was end of August that it closed. And that's looking at setting the priorities for the next 2-year block, 2019-2020, and it will also probably influence beyond that. We'll talk about more about that later. So these are, I guess, the key components that MRFF is trying to achieve. Importantly, at the top, it's not only about health benefits. So probably about 2/3 of the funding that's coming through from MRFF is looking at not only do you get an improvement for patients, improved healthcare outcome, but what is the economic impact of that? So they're really looking to stimulate the whole medtech sector in Australia through this large-scale investment in medical research. As well as that, they're looking at, as I said, how do you embed research in the healthcare systems so they can get more effective adoption and changes in practices. Collaboration, as I mentioned, it's across different parts of the sector. So between different organisations, between different disciplines, and access to research infrastructure. While the MRFF doesn't fund research infrastructure per se, they are looking to ensure that in any initiatives that are brought forward, they make effective use of infrastructure. So they're really looking at, if you bring together a group, are you sharing data well? Are you making the most of the infrastructure assets that you have? Maximising opportunities for translation by engaging with consumers. As I said, it's really looking at, are we engaging with consumers at all aspects of the innovation process? So are we listening well at the beginning when we design the new types of innovations that we're trying to bring in? Are we consulting well as we do the projects? Are we communicating well as we get to the end of the projects? And that's something there hasn't been specific funding schemes for, but there's an expectation that rolls through all the types of proposals that come forward. Positioning the research sector. So this is all about getting ready for the future. So it's looking 5 to 10 years out. What are going to be the big challenges that impact on our healthcare system? So what are the big trends that are coming through? So our aging population, for example, rise of chronic disease, new types of technologies coming online like genomics. What are the things we need to be thinking about now to be ready for that? Facilitating commercialisation. So as I said, Australia's always been fabulous at its discovery research and great at its healthcare system and the quality of its clinical delivery. We've been pretty appalling across the board in commercialisation of our research activity. So we've got a few examples where we've done that incredibly well. So the recent example out of Weehai, for example, with venetoclax. But by and large, we haven't done it well. It's not a matter of course and a matter of practice in the way we go about things. Part of that has been because there hasn't been funding for this type of activity in the middle, and that's what this is specifically trying to address. And also in terms of demonstrating value and impact, there's a real expectation that any of the projects that get funded on this are able to show at the end that they did make a long-lasting contribution to the sector. So they're not things that are going to fade as soon as the funding stops. So we've spoken about the first one, enduring and transformative. The other key thing to note with the funding principles, so these are basically were brought out probably close to a year ago now in response to the concerns people had about the way MRFF was being implemented in the first phase. And so there was a very strong call for open competitive schemes and contestable processes. And so what you see now happening for most of the new schemes as they come online is this peer-reviewed process. Not for all of them, and we'll talk about the mixture of which ones are open and which ones are targeted. Collaboration across the sectors and with end users, we've mentioned. The next one is about having a balance between what are the types of things that are going to impact on the greatest number of Australians, so looking at the burden of disease, but also understanding there are some particular segments of patients that are very underserved, and how do we look at those areas of unmet need. So there's schemes that target those, rare cancers, rare diseases, for example. And then there's a mixture of things that are really big, bold initiatives that are meant to be disruptive game changers, and other things that are meant to work closely with the health sector, particularly through the academic health science sector, to academic health science centres, I should say, to do sector level improvements. So of the new schemes, there's a whole mixture of things. So like with the NHMRC, it's not just one scheme. There's all different sorts of schemes. They're trying to pull different levers to see if they get the desired result in terms of improving the level of translation and impact. So the first year was a small level of funding that went out, about 65 million, and then you see in the last budget back in July, there was another 1.7 billion committed. So that's a lot of money to be going out to new schemes in a hurry. So that's why everybody's, I guess, getting caught by surprise. They're not quite sure what to expect of these new schemes. A lot of these new schemes are still being prepared in terms of the policies and guidelines. And so that's the reason for having talks like this. I go around the different areas of the precinct and the hospitals to help people have a sense of what's coming online. And then we have teams like my team that's based at Uni of Melbourne, but in service of the precinct and the MAC partners, and also many of the teams that are now coming online in the different institutions. And that's to help people who, because there's so much new stuff, understand a new scheme as it comes out, understand what your application should look like and how to be competitive. So here's my bubble diagram of what was announced at the last budget. There's a few new things as well that have come out since then, but these are the main ones. So the ones that people are most familiar with are the ones that overlap with the NHMRC. So there's two parts that overlapped with the NHMRC in particular were the clinician research schemes, and that was particularly around the fellowships, the TRIP fellowships, for example, and the clinical trials component. And so for those ones, instead of just inventing a whole new MRFF scheme for that, what they've done is they've poured the money in through the existing NHMRC processes. So for those ones, if you're familiar for how to apply for those, it all stays the same. There's just more money in those pots, and at different times they will target specific things in a different round, and they will look through the applications through NHMRC. The Big new one that's coming online at the moment is the Frontiers Research Scheme, and that's quite different from the rest of MRFF funding. So most MRFF funding starts with what's the clinical unmet need and then works back from that. Frontiers is looking at what are the big breakthroughs that are happening in emerging technologies that could completely transform the way we deliver healthcare, maybe 5 or 10 years out from now. So that might be things like stem cell research, it might be use of artificial intelligence in medicine, nanobots, you know, biomedical engineering discoveries, all types of things. And so it's quite interdisciplinary as well, the types of things that are being looked at. And really what they're looking for is what are those big, bold ideas that are coming through that are going to transform healthcare. We'll talk more about that scheme towards the end. The other big blobs of funding are these missions approach. So as I said, the MRFF is a priority-driven scheme. So what they're doing is picking a few big topics to focus on, where they're looking to see how can you pull together research from around Australia to tackle these big challenges. So each of those has their own panel of experts that have been brought together to look at, well, what are really the unmet needs? What are the big opportunities? What are the big challenges? How can Australia play well in this space? And then those panels are tasked with coming up with what are the schemes that we should run to deliver this funding out to the sector. So the only one of those, they've been doing a lot of thought behind the scenes. The only one that's come out so far is the brain cancer mission. And that's coming out in blocks of around 10 million a year for 10 years. The other one that people have heard a lot about that's of particular relevance to DCCC is the Genomics scheme. That's such a huge amount of funding, $500 million to genomics. And we expect that that will come online perhaps early next year. Again, the panel is working through what's the best way to deliver that out into the sector, but it is really going to be quite transformative in changing our approach to a precision medicine approach. The other two key missions, mental health and chronic disease. Mental health, as I said, these have their panels, and I expect we'll probably see something on those perhaps before the end of the year in terms of schemes in that regard. At the other end of the commercialisation spectrum is the tech translation schemes, and there's a number of different schemes that sit within this. The first one that came out was called the BioMedTech Horizon Scheme, and it was looking at things that might have an interesting proof of concept, you know, some interesting IP that's been filed, but it's really far too early for venture capital to come online. There's not enough proving up being done. And so it provides $1 million to get things through to what they call investor ready. So it's that last stage of push through, and we've had some good success in the precinct already with that scheme. So for example, one of the ones that was successfully funded in the first round was Peter Chung and his team at St Vincent's with 3D printing. So we expect that one will probably stay on the radar. I think it'll be out again before the end of this year, if not early next year, same type of thing. So again, as schemes reappear on the calendar, they will become more familiar to us. We will know what to expect. We will know what looks like a competitive application. And really for a lot of these, it's because they're all so new all at once that I guess it's hard for people to get their head around it. The other key area of funding has been funding that's gone out to the academic health research translation centres. So our centre is Melbourne Academic Centre for Health. And the other one in Victoria is the Monash Partners Academic Health Science Centre. So they've been given $6 million over a period of 3 years to allocate out to projects from their partner organisations, and I'll show you a bit more about that one as well. Health Services Research, $75 million for a range of different schemes, targeting things such as first 2,000 days, prevention, and a couple of other different things. And then there's some funding, as I've said, for some enablers like how to make better use of the existing data systems that are already available. I'm not going to go through all this. This is just to say that they're over different timeframes. So for some of them, the funding has been committed over 4 or 5 years. Some of these roll out over a much longer period. There's been commitments out through the 10-year mark. These are not the only things that will be funded by MRFF. These are just the ones that relate to the announcements in the July budget. Who can access MRFF grants and what are they for? So they're only for research and innovation. So as I said, they're not meant to be to fund a new building. They're not meant as an infrastructure grant, although I believe some infrastructure component can be included as long as it's in the benefit of the overall research and innovation project that you're putting forward. Who can apply? It's a range of different organisations, so it can be medical research institutes, universities, but it can also be Commonwealth entities like CSIRO, or it can be corporations, so industry partners as well. And they can put the funding out in different ways. So as I said, some of it's been going through the NHMRC. They can also put it out through Commonwealth agencies, and so you're seeing a mixture of different groups out in the sector who are the intermediaries that then put that funding out. So for example, Cancer Australia or the MedTech and Pharma Growth Centre, a range of different bodies. They can also enter agreements directly with jurisdictions like state governments. There's been a big planning process that's been happening in Victoria, the MRFF Grand Challenges, where the state government's been looking at where is Victoria positioned well. So that might be one mechanism there. In terms of alerts, you don't just have to rely on Mac and myself and my team for or your research officers. You can also log on directly to the Grant Connect and get regular updates on grants, MRFF grants as they come out, automatic notification. So as I said, a large proportion of the MRFF funding is trying to achieve this dual goal, not only of high quality research, health impact, but also how is that going to relate to potentially creating new high-tech jobs for Australia. This is the reason why we have been fortunate in getting such a big injection of funds, is because this aspect is very strongly supported by Australians across the board. Research Australia did a survey, and so although Australians were kind of nervous when the general innovation agenda came out, they are quite excited and hopeful for the benefits that could come from health and medical research and how that might relate to new Australian high-tech companies. So about 2/3 of the MRFF funding to date has been tagged to try and achieve both those goals at the same time. So these are some of the schemes, as I mentioned, that have those dual goals. And so this can be one of the areas that's quite new for researchers. So it may be that you're very used to writing NHMRC applications for a biomedical and a clinical review panel. In these types of schemes, you're also going to be reviewed by people who are looking for the commercialisation potential and the industry impact. And so if that's an area that you as a researcher or a clinician haven't been involved in before, that can be a bit foreign, trying to write your path to market strategy or how your IP is differentiated and that type of thing. So that's why we have commercialisation expertise embedded in the university and the organisations across the precinct. And I would highly encourage you to talk to them so that you can be ready for these types of schemes when they come online. This is the Department of Health's snapshot of sort of the breakdown of where funding is going to. In patients, that's where they're looking at things that will improve access to clinical trials and new treatments, for example. Researchers, that's really looking at, for example, the new clinician fellowships, but also the new industry research exchange program that's going to be happening. Large proportion of the funding is going to these big missions that I mentioned, and translation as all those commercialisation activities, but also the health services work. So as I said, there was frustration that people were finding it hard to predict how funding was going to be given out, and progressively we're seeing more and more of that being moved to these open competitive schemes. So already things like the clinical trials, the fellowships, the Frontier Scheme, BioMedTech Horizons, they're all independent open schemes. Some of the missions are doing it as a mixture, some of it open calls and some of it targeted, where they look at what might be good things that already exist out in the ecosystem that might need a bit more of a funding boost and then would be enabler more broadly for researchers across the country. So you will see a combination of both in the missions. And then the fully targeted funding is the funding that is going to the academic health science centres for them to give out amongst their partner organisations, but they won't run their own competitive process to do that. And speaking of which, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the recent MRFF funding that was awarded out through our Melbourne Academic Centre for Health. All the academic centre for health around Australia are doing this. We've got a great set of partner organisations. And I think the important thing to remember is, like with the VCCC, you know, the sorts of collaborative links that can be built between organisations, and all the work you do ahead of time in establishing these joint projects positions you really well for MRFF. So if you wait until MRFF funding is announced and then scramble to try and find a team, it's very hard to do it in the time frame. Often the announcement to when the application goes in is only 4 to 6 weeks. So if you haven't already had a discussion with a potential collaborator, it's going to be hard to do. And if you haven't got the track record of working with them in the past and showing how that collaboration works well and delivering impact, it's going to be hard for you to be credible. So these types of networks and structures that help us get to know our different areas of expertise, help people to start collaborating, these pieces of seed funding are to try and get that in motion. So MAC got its 6 million back in May. They have just run their process for putting that funding out to different groups within MAC. So the priorities are set by the leadership group in MAC. So the hospitals play a really important role as well in where they see the unmet needs. So it has to address both the MAC leadership priorities and also MRFF priorities as well. And that's because these projects, as I say, are seed projects which will position those teams well when they apply for large MRFF funding later on. So they received 99 project applications, 44 fellowship applications, and I think the announcements on the successful projects are later this month. And that will run every year, at least for the next 2 years, and then hopefully that will become an ongoing thing. I mentioned the Genomics Mission, and so I'm highlighting that again because that is the biggest one of all of them with the 500 million that's coming out. There will be different types of components that are within that. So they're really looking at how do we make the most of genomics and where it's up to in terms of getting that out into the way we deliver better clinical outcomes. So how do we embed it in the health services and practices? What are the new types of workforce training that we need to do? What clinical trials do we need to do to establish an evidence base for its use? What are the data and analytics types of activities that we need to establish and train people up on it and know how to use the data well? So as I said, I think that's early next year that we'll see a lot of that come out into the sector. Thought I'd talk briefly now about the consultation process that's been running. I hope everybody had a chance to participate. They did roadshows right around Australia. As I said, these priorities get set in 2-year blocks. So if you don't engage proactively and say, we think this is an important area because here's how this is going to improve outcomes for Australians. Here's the high quality of research that we have that can contribute to this. Here's the set of partnerships that we can work with in order to deliver those outcomes. If you don't engage in that process and you don't explain how you can deliver impact, then you don't get the buckets allocated in the 2-year process. And they then define where the future funding schemes come. So it's no guarantee. It's not lobbying in the sense that you're lobbying for your project, but you are lobbying for a topic area and a category that you can then apply for in a competitive process. So a lot of the funding was already committed in MRFF in terms of the announcements in the July budget. So the consultation process that's been happening is really influencing this remaining unallocated funding that's happening here from the 2019 to the 22 period. Definitely not going to go through all of that. I really just wanted to say in terms of a sense of process, these are the 5-year strategy that is set up in terms of general categories for MRFF, and then every 2 years the priorities will be set that relate to each of those key areas, and then that informs the Minister and the Department of Health about where they might set MRFF funding initiatives. So some of these matched up, not all of them went on to get funded in that first 2-year phase. Some of the priorities from this period will roll over to the next period. Some of them will disappear, some new ones will come online, but that's what that consultation process is for, is to set these things, which then influence where the funding and the schemes actually go. And this is also what informs it. So the Medical Research Future Fund has its own act, and it has requirements for how the funding should go out into the sector. So one of these things is around how do you deliver the greatest value for all Australians, and the other part is about how does it enhance other financial assistance. So it's really looking to, you'll see in a lot of the schemes, you're far more competitive if you have a source of co-contribution of funding, whether that's philanthropy, whether it's state government, whether it's an industry partner, whether it's a community group. They're really looking to see this combination of sources of funding in high impact projects. Here's some of the recent funding that's gone out. You're able to see all the recent funding also on the Research Australia website. If you want to, they're a great source of information. The MRFF Department of Health has a great website as well. They're starting to put more information up there. You'll see all the recent funding announcements. And as I said, if you register on Grant Connect, you'll be alerted automatically as well as new schemes come out. So some of the ones that were particularly good for us here. So we've received one of the new clinical trials, stem cells research that's managed through the University of Melbourne. That's a national initiative though that goes right across a number of different states. So a mixture of smaller things happening as well as the larger schemes I talked about before. I did want to quickly mention, how are we going for time? All right, the Frontiers scheme, because as I said, that's a huge one that's coming online before the end of this year. It's quite different from the rest of MRFF, so we might spend a little bit more time on that one. It's really looking for these big picture, major breakthroughs, enabling technology innovation that's going to transform healthcare. So it's a big, bold ideas is what they're looking for. It's going to be a two-step process. So the first process is going to be an expression of interest call, and that's where they want you to blow them away with your big idea, talk about the types of team that you've brought together to tackle that challenge, how it's going to be transformative for the sector, and how this will position Australia as a leader in that domain. So they're looking for, if they make a big investment in an area, how is it that Australia could take a leadership position and that flow through to economic impact. So for the first 10 that will be selected, they think they're going to choose about 10 per year. They will receive up to $1 million for a year, and that's to then put together a more detailed business case. So these things are going to be large in scale. They're looking at funding 10 to 20 million a year for up to 5 years. So you're looking at 50 to 100 million in their initiatives. They're a bit like, for example, a cooperative research centre. They're expected to be a mixture of partner organisations, not only research organisations, but also healthcare organisations and potentially industry partners or investors or community groups, for example. And because those things are quite large and complex to build, that's why they're allowing $1 million in a year for people to put together a fully detailed business case so that when they make those investment decisions, it can be well informed. They'll probably fund about 6 of those over the next 4 years. When people are getting ready for Frontiers, we recently did an expression of interest right across the precinct through Melbourne Academic Centre for Health. We had about 43 applications for that, and there's about 6 teams that are looking highly competitive, and another 6 teams we're working to get up to a competitive level. So basically run workshops with them to help them think about how they can make their bids as competitive as possible. So making them, so one of the things is to think about, you know, have you really got that big breakthrough idea? The sort of thing they're thinking about is, how's your research going to lead to the next CSL or the next cochlear or the next bionic eye? So really, really big thing, disruptive and transformative. And are you able to demonstrate that your research and the team that you've brought together really is internationally competitive and at the leading edge of the field? And how are you going to consolidate that? Health impact. So you have to show that you're not only going to have savings in the healthcare sector, what are the big improvements that you're going to have in terms of patient benefits? And while you have to be able to show that for Australians, you really need to also be showing how that's going to be globally relevant. Otherwise, you can't hit the economic impact criteria because you're really going to need to be looking to create businesses that are playing into global markets. So economic impact, as I said, this is something that not all medical researchers are necessarily familiar with, and that's why we have bid development teams that work with people who are putting frontiers together, particularly to help them with these aspects if that's something that they haven't already got covered. Dream team, so you're expected to pull together the ultimate team of people from around Australia as pertains to solving your problem. So if you put together a project that's coming from one institution, it's highly unlikely that you will be successful. That would be a bit of a tough call to think that all the best expertise in Australia came from only one place. So think about, you know, who would be on your wish list if you were given $100 million? Who are the people that you would actually go and put on your team to solve this problem? Track record. So does your team not only have high quality research track record, but have you got people on your team that have shown that they can implement, people who know how to do translation, people who know how to manage big programs like this? So look for that spread of expertise. And then who are going to be your supporters? Who are your backers and co-funders? Have you engaged patient advocates? Have you spoken to consumer groups? Have you got out into community organisations? Have you spoken to state government? Have you spoken to investment groups? So you really should be looking at, as pertains to your particular problem that you're looking to solve, which are the right groups that you should be going and engaging right from the outset? Are they on board? Will they speak strongly for you? Would they be involved as a collaborator? Would they potentially invest? The other thing to think about is there a way that you can show that you address different components of the overall MRFF strategic priorities, or how might you leverage outcomes that are coming out of some of the other things that the MRFF has funded? Do they relate to the initiative that you're putting forward? Clinical trials, we've spoken about that, as I said, big investment into the clinical trials programs, and another 42 specifically for promoting international clinical trial collaborations. These are the various biomed commercialisation schemes that I spoke about. One of the new ones that will be coming online is this industry research exchange and training program. This is trying to get this sort of cross-pollination happening across the sector so that people can perhaps pursue different types of career paths, so they can go out and explore what it's like in industry, or industry can come here and give us the benefits of some of their expertise. So I really wanted to, in summing up, just particularly mention again that there's often a very short time frame to respond. So the extent that you can absorb some of this and start thinking about your great ideas now, I think that will help position you to get ready. And I give people cheat sheets of things to go and think about in the shower and with their collaborators that will help you be ready when a new scheme comes out. So these are some of the general questions that you'd want to think about for any type of MRFF scheme. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of this. It's obviously different if you're thinking particularly about something like a Frontiers Emerging Disruptive Technology scheme, and different again if you're thinking about a scheme that relates to the final stages of technology commercialisation. All of these will be available to you, so you can work through them later. There's a range of support. You can come through me. We have a new MRFF project officer who's just been appointed on Friday and will start with us in a few weeks' time. We also have Nick Walsh, who does a marvellous job in MAC in terms of coordinating all the MRFF activities through the partner organisations. And we're just recruiting a bid writer at the moment to also support the teams that are doing the really large proposals. That's where you can go to get more information directly as well from the Department of Health and from Grants Connect. That's it from me. Happy to take questions.
Yep. Okay, so we've got plenty of time for some questions. If you do have one, just pop your hand up and try and get a mic too, because there's about 20 people online who'd like to hear the questions as well. I'd love to start off. Okay,
I think you're scribbling down some information from your slide, but are the slides available online?
They're not available online, but I can get them out through, if you're one of the BCCC partner organisations, they'll be available.
It's kind of specifically asked about the Frontier initiative. What's is that going to be year by year, or is this going to be just one format?
So they've committed 240 million to the overall scheme. The latest announcement, so there's only a small amount of information out in the public domain at the moment, so we're all still waiting to see what the new guidelines are, how many they do each year. But they have said that they're looking at doing a short list of 10 each year, and that there will be 6 funded over a 4-year period. So what that says to me is that it's going to be happening on a yearly basis, that they'll take a new set of applications to review and choose from.
In that respect, so you said you've already looked at all the proposals through MAP. Is that going to be then yearly, or is it any time you can, if anybody has a frontiers idea, just come to you?
Yeah, so that was just to kickstart the process to find out what was out there in the system. But people can come to me freely at any time. So as well as the ones that we did in that process, there's probably been another 12 or 15 that have come in afterwards. So it's wasn't a cut-off thing, it was just a way to get started. Oh, sorry.
The Genomics Mission,
Yep.
Just wanted to know, we've got good representation across MAC on that on that panel, and for, we're going to be well represented locally.
So the panel, well, the one we have from the precinct that's on that panel is Catherine North from MCRI. She's on that panel. People are not meant to be on the panel to lobby for their own area, but obviously they bring a perspective of different views of what's going on in different places. In terms of getting ready for the Genomics Mission, there's a lot of work that's being done, for example, through the group of 8 have been compiling information about what's accessible through different universities and different sites so that they can get a sense of what infrastructure's out there, what types of research programs are already happening. I'm not on that panel, so I'm not sure how far along they are with deciding how they're going to put the schemes together and how they're going to put them out to the sector. They're not really looking for us to lobby them at this stage. They'd like to make an informed decision. But of the calls that we've done out across the precinct, there's probably about 15 proposals that have come back into me that relate to genomics. And so I've been thinking we should actually put them all together. So we've got a nice little booklet that people can flick through and that give ideas of the types of projects that people are shovel ready, so to speak, that would be ready to put out there should funding become available. So it's not to say those projects would be funded, but they give people a sense of, well, here's the types of things that we're thinking about across our network. They're also really useful for us in that respect, in that we look at some of them and we say, oh, well, actually, that one would fit really well with that one. And we've had a lot of that happening through the first call process. We've had a lot of matchmaking, so to speak, and while people aren't compelled to come together, most of the people that have been introduced to each other have gone on to start building some collaborative linkages. So that's been a useful thing in terms of the process, and the helicopter view is to see different types of components of research activity, which on their own would probably be not competitive for MRFF because they were subscale, but that you combine them up in different ways and then they become really interesting. AI in medicine has been one like that. We found we had 9 different projects, AI in medicine. They were all different because they were all different clinical domains and different institutions. They'll make a quite compelling proposition, and now there's a national bid on AI in medicine coming together.
Good. I think that's where the benefit will be, the consolidation of our resources and expertise around the precinct, particularly in the genomics area. So that's good. That's positive. Yeah. That you'll reckon there's an overarching kind of body recognising that these people should be working together. So that's great. Yeah. And I think also that what to say about lobbying is really important too. To make sure that it's a consolidated process right through from start to finish. Thanks.
Got a question here.
Is there any limitation on the amount of overseas expertise that could be part of the team?
So there's no limitation on having international collaborators involved, but the funding can't go to offshore. So under the MRFF Act, I believe, the funding has to be spent in Australia. But a lot of teams are getting very clever and speaking to their international collaborators and already starting to look at how they might line schemes up in parallel. So there might be funding that comes to a large international collaborative team where they get their funding from, say, NCI in the US, and we get our funding through MRFF for a big program that will be even more exciting. So people are starting to think along those lines. There's if international collaborators came here, that could probably be funded, but they certainly like to see the international collaborative connections. It speaks well to how we can play better on a global stage.
Thank you, Heather, for your presentation. We'll move on with the presentation, Virginia and Bernie. Heather, just you mentioned that your own team, you're going to have a new bid manager start.
Yep.
Could you just tell us how involved your own team can be if, for example, you have a whole host of questions with respect to potential collaborators, what may work, almost doing a sort of a simulator, if you like, if you're thinking about the frontiers in the first stage.
Yeah. So in terms of economy of effort, given that we're a very small team at this stage, we've tried to do it in a consolidated way in the first pass. So anybody who put in an EOI through the first call out that we did, we ran a session for everyone at once, and actually I think pretty much all of the 43 bid leads came along to that, and so we could step them through, here's what it looks like to be a competitive application for a Frontiers application. And then also people could benefit from hearing the types of questions that other teams were asking in terms of how do you tackle this bit or how do you tackle that bit. To the extent that I can, I have been meeting with individual teams and giving, so I normally put a limit of half an hour to an hour per team around upfront strategic advice, and then people have to go away and it's kind of like a self-help manual. Go do these things, and then if you've done those things, come back and we'll have another go to help. If we had an infinite amount of resource, we would put project officers on teams to go and help those teams get ready. I don't have an infinite amount of resource. Maybe if we're successful in MRFF over the next couple of years, that's something that we'll be able to move into. But some of the organisations, the institutions, are already starting to put that resource together themselves as well. So if you're connected to one of the institutions, you may be able to find you can get additional support other than just the strategic advice that I can provide. Thanks.
Yes, thanks very much for that talk. Christopher Ray from MRFF. If a member of your application, say a company, already receives funding through the BTF, say via a venture capital fund, is that a plus or a minus when you're going for this MRFF? I noticed you had BTF and MRFF running alongside each other on one of the earlier slides. Does it rule you out, or is it considered positive?
It's a brave new world. It's a good question, and I'll be looking forward to see how you go as you try that out. I suspect that the only limitation is you're not allowed to double dip. So in terms of, so the analogy that I can think of is people have asked, if I get funded in one MRFF scheme, is that going to limit me applying for another scheme? And the answer that I got back from Department of Health is no, there's no limitation as long as you don't ask to be funded for the same thing twice. So if you've been funded through BTF for activities in your company, I think that's a good thing. That shows that you're on that trajectory, you're getting out there in the market, particularly if you've used the fund wisely and they're impressed with what you're doing. If you're applying for MRFF though, the difference is that most of that is at a slightly earlier stage in BTF. So you'd probably be more competitive if you were doing a collaboration with a medical research organisation, whether that's research in a hospital environment or an MRI or a university. But that cross-sectoral piece is, I think, something they're particularly looking for, whereas BTF might be looking more, you could just put your company forward and get a project funded within the company. So you'd position slightly differently for MRFF, but I doubt that you would be excluded from MRFF by having a BTF application.
Yeah, thank you.
I might just ask, I think the thing I
appreciate it was it's a brand new world, so it's very hard to predict what the next funding initiative is going to be.
Yeah.
I like the slide you had up, and then tap back to it about how we as individuals can sort of prepare for the general principles. We could, yeah, that's right, that we could think about as we wait for these initiatives to come up. I thought that was that's just sort of worth ending on that and a good reminder.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I really encourage people to think about is think bold in the problems you want to tackle. So they're really looking for us to step up from, like I've said, small-scale investigative-driven projects to, particularly for the clinical leaders amongst us, you know, what are the things that bother you whether we don't have a really good solution for it at the moment, or what are our patients and consumer groups telling us, you know, this is a real major unmet need, and then us stepping up to that to say, okay, I might only have part of the solution for that, but I agree it's a good problem to solve. And so to the extent that we can start to mobilise ourselves, and a great one that I've seen come together, for example, is the Brain Cancer Consortium group that's led by Tony Burgess out of Weehai. So they had a brainstorming session last week, and I think about 40 or 50 people came together from all different organisations looking at, you know, well, what might we do in developing better drugs, or doing clinical trials better, or different drug delivery. And so there were people in the room who hadn't met each other before, and it was really sort of sitting down and thinking about, okay, what are the challenges that we could tackle that we haven't in the past done collectively, and bringing different types of people into that room that might not be brain cancer people, but they might have expertise that they could share that would be relevant to that group. We've got one happening this week on disability, for example, and it's an invitation whereby it's led by the Melbourne Disability Institute, but it's reaching out to all types of researchers and organisations that might have something that they could contribute collaboratively to tackling big challenges in that space. So I think getting ready in terms of thinking about really good problems to solve, that gets you ready for MRFF, and thinking about who else might you need on that journey. And if you have those two components, everything else is solvable.
So very well said, and thank you. That was a great discussion and a great talk. Before we end, I'll just have a cross just to remind everybody of the upcoming talks again. If you can see them all. Right, so just to remind you all, and the way to register here is to go on the VCCC website and register. So we've got Misha Ketchell, Grant MacArthur, the Herald Sun writer, and Drew Berry from the Weehai in the next 3 weeks. So before we finish, I've got a small gift for Heather, which I'd like to give you on behalf of the VCCC, and please join me in thanking Heather for her talk.